As Taiwan remembers one of its darkest moments in history, the 228 incident, we take a look at transitional justice.
I speak with Waseda University professor Arata Hirai about why transitional justice is so important for Taiwan.
This is Taiwan Insider. Welcome to the show. This week was the 76th anniversary of the 228 incident.
The infamous 1947 massacre ushered Taiwan into 4 decades of martial law and was remembered with events in Taipei this week. Let's take a look.
Human rights lawyers and victims' families lay down roses to commemorate the 228 incident. The massacre took place 76 years ago. It's estimated that between 18,000 and 28,000 people died in the crackdown following an anti-government uprising. This week, many civil group members marched on the streets to honor the victims. The march started at the Tianma Tea House where the uprising took place. Zhen Zumei is the daughter of late democracy martyr Zhen Nanrong, who set himself on fire for freedom of speech. She says there needs to be serious discussions about transitional justice. Zhen also calls for current political figures like Taipei Mayor Jiang Wan-an to acknowledge their past to win the trust of the Taiwanese people. Jiang is a member of the Kuomintang, which was the ruling party at the time of the uprising. He also claims to be the great-grandson of Chiang Kai-shek, who was Taiwan's president during the martial law period that followed the 228 incident. Many people are still grieving the loss of family members who died during the massacre. Taiwan's government is still working to heal those wounds, which are remembered every year on February 28th. The 228 incident is one of the most important events in Taiwan's history. It's also at the center of the country's transitional justice process.
To learn more about transitional justice in Taiwan, I spoke with Waseda University professor Arata Hirai to learn more about why it's so important.
Transitional justice is a legal and political mechanism pursued by societies that have experienced systematic violence or human rights violation, aiming to overcome their past and pursue reconciliation. It includes truth-seeking, prosecution, compensation for victims, and institutional reform. The global trend towards pursuing transitional justice has expanded beyond the concept of political transition in comparative politics, and it has spread around the world since the 1980s, starting in Latin America. This includes the democratization of authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, a conflict resolution in the context of nation building after civil war, and redressing historical injustice in post-colonial region or among indigenous populations. In modern Taiwan political history, the development of transitional justice has been multi-layered and has followed these kind of global trends. After the initial reform for democratization during the Li Denghui administration, the government began to redress the past wrongdoings of the 228 incident and the White Terror, which was state violence by the KMT authoritarian government. It was in response to demands from victims' families and the opposition's activists claiming for the state responsibility and political rehabilitation under the martial law.
This week was the 76th anniversary of the 228 massacre, which occurred in February of 1947, or at least it began at that time. This event, what kind of role does it have in Taiwan's historical memory and also in its transitional justice process?
The 228 incident, which is widely discussed by scholars, had a significant impact on Taiwanese society. I think this incident occurred when Taiwan was struggling to define its identity socially and legally after being liberated from colonialism. It bounced around between different ruling powers until Japan surrendered in 1945 and Taiwan was handed over to the Republic of China. But here is the thing. Taiwan didn't get the same status as a Chinese province. Instead, it was placed under the colonial-like special rule of the Taiwan Provincial Administration Office, right? So for a while, it was like one country, two system between Taiwan and mainland China at that time. But less than 2 years later, this 228 massacre went down, a total state terror attack to the Taiwanese citizen. This escalated the ethnic conflict between mainlanders and Taiwanese people, and eventually led to the formation of a unique Taiwanese ethnicity. So transitional justice in Taiwan it has been fueled by grassroots democracy movement in civil society, similar to the other regions worldwide.
You earlier mentioned the Transitional Justice Commission, which disbanded last year, as one of the main institutions of transitional justice in Taiwan. However, that commission was very controversial from its inception. Why is that?
Yes, in general, progressive policies such as transitional justice are controversial. If you do it, you will be criticized by conservatives, and if you don't, or even if you do, be criticized by reformers in terms of how you do it. So either way, it will be controversial. I think the main reason for the controversy is that it tends to be seen as an instrumental use of transitional justice by the administration, both by conservative oppositions and by human rights advocacy groups. For example, the revelation of a private conversation in 2018 before the local election, in which the chief of the Transitional Justice Commission discussed using information about the past incident involving state violence for negative election campaign against the KMT candidate. This is a typical example of why citizens see transitional justice as being politicized.
What do you believe are the greatest weaknesses in Taiwan's transitional process? You've already touched on some of them.
I think there are two main greatest weaknesses of transitional justice in Taiwan. One is time. That is, too much time has passed since both the democratization from the authoritarian regime and the occurrence of historical injustice to the indigenous people. So many victims are perpetrators are dying, which may make it increasingly difficult to disperse materials, fade memories, and ascertain the scale of damage and compensation. Secondly, there are also constitutional constraints. In order to break through the legal restriction of the state, as I mentioned earlier, and totally eradicate the symbol of the authoritarian regime, some people are even saying that a fundamental reform is necessary, including the construction of a new state to promote a post-Republic of China state system.
You can catch the interview on our social media platforms.
And if you like our content, do subscribe and follow us below. Now, Itamar, I know you wanted to cover the topic of transitional justice in depth. Tell me why you think it's so important for Taiwan.
Wow, well, I just think transitional justice and the process ongoing today in Taiwan is so essential to understanding Taiwanese politics and society. I think Taiwan is a really unique society because it has so many layers of historical injustices from different periods, from different groups of people. And all of them, though they of course are injustices, they have influenced who and Taiwanese people are today and what Taiwan is. And I think transitional justice in a way is kind of a process to decide who we really are as Taiwanese. And I think that's sort of extremely important to understand.
It is, and it seems that a lot of people are still dealing with the wounds from the past, right?
Right. And not only that, but like the past in many ways informs the real issues in today's politics. You know, the divide between pan green and pan blue in many senses is a divide over your understanding of Taiwanese history and what Taiwan really is. And you can just see just from what we saw, you know, this week, for example, when Jiang Guanan, the mayor of Taipei, you know, his speech during 228 was interrupted by a bunch of protesters. So you can see that these issues, amazingly, so many decades afterwards, they continue to be so salient to people.
I also know that your family is from Argentina.
That's right.
And that that country also dealt with a process of transitional justice. How would you compare the two countries?
Yeah, so my parents, all my family, they're from Argentina. My parents grew up in a military dictatorship that was similar, not exactly the same, to the 4 decades of martial law that Taiwan underwent. And I think one of the reasons I got interested in transitional justice and began reporting on it when I first came to Taiwan was because I saw so many differences in the processes that occurred in both countries. In Argentina, for example, after democratization in the early 80s, there was a process to basically find out, the historical truths, and then put on trial all the perpetrators and the leaders of the military junta, and then also reform the military to ensure that doesn't happen again. So there was a real effort to kind of find out the historical facts and then turn another page and begin as a new country, as a new society. And today, for example, there's very little nostalgia for the military governments of the past, even though, for example, Argentina's economy, many people believe, was better at that time. But in Taiwan, you don't have any of that. In Taiwan, the democratization process was begun by the very actor, the institution, the KMT, who was committing historical injustices previous to democratization. And because that process occurred, or democratization occurred without any attempt to kind of remove the perpetrators of martial law, right, and punish them, today we've reached this point where any attempt at transitional justice dealing with that period also directly attacks one of the important political parties, right? And that is why, for example, Professor Hirai talked about this, that from the beginning that the Transitional Justice Commission was started, the Pan-Blue camp believed that it was just a tool to attack them. And in a way, that's true, because it was their own party that perpetrated all these crimes in the past, right? So I think Taiwan's very difficult because it's a country that wants to recognize itself as a democracy. It likes to advertise itself as, the most democratic country in Asia, for example. But it has a lot of difficulties dealing with this past. And that's not even to mention the other past historical injustices. For example, Professor Hirai talked about this a little bit, injustice against indigenous people, where there's really a very, very weak process in Taiwan to deal with these, or injustices committed against people during Japanese colonization, which there's really no interest from the Pan-Green camp to touch upon.
Do you think there's anything that Taiwan can learn from Argentina's example?
It's very hard to compare because you can see how historical developments has created a situation where it's hard to do what Argentina did. It's very, very hard to right now.
You can't lock up the KMT or the
exactly.
Right?
How could you do that? I mean,
Right.
Jiang Guanan, he changed his name to his great grandfather and grandfather's name, even though his father was supposedly an illegitimate son of Jiang Jingguo, because that name still connects with so many people in Taiwan, right?
Right.
So
it's very
and
complicated. It's not simple.
And not only that, you have Tsai Ing-wen last year, they opened the Jiang Jingguo library very close to here, actually. And she went and she gave a speech, right? How can it be? How can the leader of the modern Taiwanese democracy is giving a speech at a library commemorating a person who most people would agree was a dictator, right? So I think it's very hard to copy the process that occurred in Argentina here. And I think this is really something that leaders and civil society have to think about very carefully in Taiwan to see how to move forward, because you can't just paper over these things, They continue to cause problems in the society. I mean, forget for a second the real victims who are still alive and suffering, right? And their names haven't been rectified. The society and the political system, they are still suffering from the fact that they haven't been able to come together and come to a resolution.
Well, thanks so much, Itamar, for your interview and for your insights.
Of course.
And I hope this has given you a little insight into Taiwan society. Thanks for tuning in to Taiwan Insider. I'm Natalie Tso.
I'm Itamar Waksman.
And do check out all of our social media channels. We hope that you follow and subscribe.
Yeah, you can follow us on Facebook and on Twitter.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.